Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk Podcast. On this episode, I'm looking at a subject that on the face of it might seem like a contradiction in terms. That subject is behavioural law. In other words, looking at law through a behavioural lens. The idea behind this is that since we write laws and rules in order to influence human behaviour, it makes sense to explore whether or not the laws and rules have the desired effect. Because if they don't, then what's the point in having them? And if we've got ineffective laws, then we're not mitigating human risk. It's a subject I've explored before with academics. There are links to relevant episodes in the show notes. And in fact, it formed the subject of the very first episode of this show. This time, I'm exploring it with a practitioner. That's right, someone working in a law firm whose job it is to think about behavioural dynamics. Nitish Upadhyaya is a behavioural scientist who's also a lawyer. He works for Ropes and Gray, a firm that has a behavioural insights lab that explores exactly this subject. I wanted to invite him onto the show because every time I speak to him, he makes me think and sparks new ideas. So I thought it would be fascinating for you to hear about what he does and the way that he looks at the world. Before we begin, my usual reminder to you that my book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioural Science to Ethics and Compliance, is out now. If you're interested in this subject, and frankly, why wouldn't you be, then it's the perfect accompaniment to this episode, because what applies to law also applies to compliance. You can get a link to read the first few chapters of Humanizing Rules for free by looking in the show notes. With that said, please enjoy, as I know you will, my conversation with Nitish Upadhyaya on behavioural law. Nitish, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited about having you here because you and I have had some great conversations together in the past. I'm looking forward to sharing this one with a broader audience. And obviously, I know who you are, but many of my listeners might not. So can you give me a little pen portrait?
So, believe it or not, I'm a lawyer by background. And I think that's probably what interested you most when we first connected. What is a lawyer doing in this space? So I started my career investigating bankers for market manipulation, insider dealing. I also did some work in the English commercial court. And I did both the investigation side and the remediation side. So working with banks to figure out what went wrong, but also how do we stop this from happening again? The technical solutions, are there training solutions? What do we need to do to ensure compliance with the rules? I then moved into an innovation role. I led the innovation team at a law firm, which was a lot more of a creative role, thinking about how we execute on our legal work better, taking in ideas from all sorts of disciplines, predominantly user-centered design, thinking about the actual user, our end user, our clients, or the regulators, whoever it might be. I worked in building client-facing products, also thinking about internal efficiencies. And it was that idea of bringing in skills from outside legal that was really fascinating. I have always been interested in human behavior, and all throughout my career, I could see that while we were doing all these incredible things as lawyers, very technical, analytical things, we just weren't appreciating the fundamental elements of human behavior that our work product was really influencing. And so, having done all the required pop science reading for an aspiring behavioral scientist, I went back to university. I have a master's in behavioral science from the LSE. And now I'm director of behavioral insights at R&G Insights Lab, thinking about how we use all of these different disciplines, cultural psychology, behavioral science, data visualization within legal as it influences a whole host of different things: compliance, organizational culture, DE&I. And I think I come back when I'm explaining what a lawyer is doing in this space to something that Benjamin von Roy and Adam Fine say in their book, that lawyers are behavioral novices. And I think that's right. We don't quite understand the power that we have as lawyers to influence human behavior. And I think that's going to change.
I find that really fascinating because when I think about the role of lawyers, it's kind of creating constructs that ultimately are driving at human behavior. You think about we write the law for people ultimately, and sort of to govern human decision making and human behavior. So you've got the sort of the architect piece, and then in the sorts of scenarios you talked about, it's kind of like something has gone wrong, and then the lawyers get involved in the cleanup slash remediation processes that follow. And often, why do we bring lawyers in? Well, we want to minimize our liability as a company and make sure that minimize the amount of hassle that we'll get in front of regulators in the courts. And so that, in many respects, is a very sort of theoretical construct. And so what you're beautifully saying is that actually, ultimately, this is all about people. And so if we want to design, if we take both of those steps, and I'm deliberately simplifying for obvious reasons, if we take the design phase, then if we design things with humans in mind, we'd have less of these issues arising. But equally, in the kind of cleanup operation, we need to be thinking about it, because otherwise we can solve problems theoretically, but actually we're going to have the same thing happening again. We need to be bearing in mind the human dynamics that underpin what the law is there to do and what lawyers are there to serve as we make those thoughts. So I think this is really, really interesting. And it almost surprises me there aren't more people thinking in those terms.
I hope they will be over the next little while, because what we're doing isn't necessarily working, right? We've been doing this sort of work for 10, 20, 30 years, putting in place policies, training, reactionary measures when something goes wrong, or trying to be proactive, but not actually sort of really hitting the nub of the problem, maybe hitting an assumption of what the problem actually is rather than, say, the root cause or the root behavior. And you're right, policymakers more generally, our legislators are tasked with creating the rules that govern human behavior. You may or may not do this. You are incentivized to do something, or you are fined for not, or for doing something that you shouldn't do. But they don't understand human behavior, or few people really understand human behavior. And it's like a structural engineer not having a grasp of basic mathematics or physics, when creating this bridge that people have to cross. And it really is striking in some of the pieces of legislation we get, or some of the pronouncements we see. They're just not quite right when it comes to what you and I know and what the listeners of this show know about how humans actually behave versus what we think they do.
And I love that, because the more, once you start thinking in those terms, you just go, that's just idiotic. And I think for most people, you come across this when, I don't know, we're dealing with a bureaucratic process that just seems pointless, or something that is just feels disproportionate in some way, or is missing, it grates. And so on an instinctive, visceral level, we all understand that. We've all had to do things, comply with rules that seem stupid. At its most simple, sit at a red traffic light when there is no good reason to be sat at that red traffic light, except for the fact that they've designed the traffic lights in a way that doesn't reflect the realities of the world. And so we know this instinctively. And yet there is money, time, and effort spent on designing things that are, I'll use the term, inhumane, that really don't reflect the realities of how humans operate. And that seems to me to be, to use a legal term, negligent, right? It just seems to me as how can you be in charge of design? Because as you say, you wouldn't be allowed to put a bridge up if there was a risk of that bridge falling down. There'd be, I don't know anything about architecture, but I'll have a crack at building a bridge. Right? That's irresponsible. And yet we have a whole, and this isn't just the law. This goes much more broadly into the compliance field. And there are other areas. People that are designing things that are there to influence human decision making and behavior, that don't really understand or speak human.
And that, in its simplest context, it might be a website. I suspect you've been on plenty of websites where you've tried to check out and you just don't know where the checkout button is, or you're stuck and you're going round and round in circles trying to put your address in, or whatever it might be. And, websites are getting better, user experience and design is getting better. But even at its simplest stage, when people are asking you to do things that benefit them, purchase something, there can be a lot of sort of dross or, quicksand when it comes to that. And then you abstract that out to some of the bigger processes that we have in our society, whether it's compliance or otherwise, just filling in forms to get things sorted out. All of those things tend to suffer from overcomplication, from people not understanding human behavior. And there are lots of really interesting behavioral science studies around that, thinking about how we make things easier, how we make things simpler to understand, but also just think about who the end user is. And that doesn't need behavioral science, that just needs a bit of common sense.
When we look at behavioral science as a discipline, there are lots of people there that sort of say, well, okay, this is a science, right? So we need to have randomized control trials and a whole load of architecture around it because, well, otherwise it's just guesswork. And for me, there's a middle ground here, which is to say that, of course, if you're going to spend a ton of money on something, before you do that, you have the ability to test it. So you're doing something scale. It probably does make sense to say, let's see if our presumptions are correct. But I think
Yes.
there are lots of other examples where you can just deploy common sense. If I can make something take 5 minutes of someone's time as opposed to 10 and get the same, I don't need to test that, right? That's just got to be a better thing. And I think what's really interesting talking to you in the conversations that you and I have had is this isn't about how do we always get the optimal result. And if I look at something like marketing, marketing, what you want to do if you're designing an ad campaign is you want to make sure it increases sales by the maximum amount. And so you put a load of effort to make sure that that's the case. But if you're looking at sort of compliance context, anything you can do to make the world better, make people more compliant, more likely to do the right thing, then we should just be implementing this stuff. And so to your point is, I think there's almost a lot of fear in this space of sort of, oh, well, this is a fear and trepidation because I need to. I just think actually how lots of situations can be solved with a bit of good old fashioned common sense, for want of a better phrase.
I think that's right. And it's, sometimes it just requires someone who is in that business context just to take a step back. And look, I know budgets are being cut, people are trying to do more with less, and there's a whole ecosystem and a narrative that we need to think about more generally. But and people are sort of hard pressed. They're always in the mix. They're always having to respond. They're always having to do things. And so you don't necessarily get that time to sort of take that step back and strategize. And that's where, partnering with people or thinking about things from other industries might help. But ultimately, it's those people that really understand the context who are going to be able to deliver something that's different or, cuts out some of the rubbish. When I in one of my previous roles, we ran a campaign with a client, which was called the Stop campaign. And we asked them to think about processes that they were utilizing, which could be stopped. And they asked a whole number of their sort of groups and departments, completely sort of open, sort of amnesty, if you like, on some of these processes.
Hand in your process.
Well, they were just trying to be a little bit different. And so we got to looking at 5, 10, 15 of these things. This is more from an innovation context. Some of these processes were just cyclical. They're just one person put something to another person who put it to another person, and it just sort of went round because maybe a number of years ago it'd been relevant to something business related, and now actually it really wasn't. And so we could cut some of that out, and by cycling out some of that time, suddenly people had a little bit more, to think about new ways of doing things or, to progress. And I think time is incredibly important in that.
And I think that's really interesting because we can see that in lots of areas, right? So if we step outside the compliance, if I think about meetings as a really good example, right? Why do we run meetings that are half an hour or an hour? Well, the answer is that historically a meeting involved getting people into a room. You can't say to someone, can you walk halfway across the office for a 5-minute chat with a load of other people, get everybody together for 5 minutes? That feels incredibly wasteful. And there's always there's sort of get in the lift and going to get coffee. And there's all this sort of paraphernalia around a physical meeting. And that's why I think suddenly, we better do it for an hour because we can't drag everybody to this location. Whereas in the digital world, you could just literally log on for 5 minutes, jump onto a call, jump off. And we've carried that simple construct of something has to be a half an hour, or 2 hours or whatever. We've carried that through into the digital world. And for me, that's a really good illustration of the point you're making, which is sort of like we just continue to do legacy things for no good reason. Doesn't mean, I think the flip side is what we mustn't do is just go, well, this is all legacy crap. Let's get rid of it because maybe there was a good reason why that was introduced and we don't want to find out what that reason was. But so we need to understand what is the basis on which processes and structures and rules have been designed. So let's understand that. And then let's say to ourselves, does that actually deliver the objective? And I think then you get into the territory of and I see this with training quite a bit. Let's train everybody in the organization on some regulation because that's risk averse, because then we can say to the regulators, everybody has been trained on this without thinking about, is this relevant? And if I've dragged someone into a training session for something that is never going to be relevant to them, I've pissed them off, I've wasted their time, and I've sent a signal that I'm an idiot who doesn't actually understand what they do. And therefore anything I produce is going to be coming from the house of idiot. And so even when they're all relevant things, there's a risk of them going, oh, these are those clowns that made me sit through that. This will be more of that tedious nonsense. I'm not going to pay attention. And so I think, that for me is where we start to say we can be much smarter about it. And the other bit I find weird is when we look at human capital as a resource, why are we wasting people's time, making them read stuff that's pointless, making them do boring things? You wouldn't do that with any other form of asset that you invested in for your business. You'd be thinking after, how do I get the best value out of this thing? And we don't do that with human capital for some reason.
No, it's strange, isn't it? Oh, well, there's so much in that, in that little bit. I think just going back to your idea about meetings, I think it was Shopify recently that on, start of this year, they just said we're canceling all of our meetings. I think it was tens of thousands or tens of hundreds of hours of meetings that just disappeared from people's calendars if they were, if they fit a certain sort of pattern. That was their way of saying, right, we're just going to do things completely differently. To your point about going on either end of the spectrum, either sticking to exactly what you've got or going all the way to the other end. That completely misunderstands the context of what exactly meetings are there for, what the context is, what's useful, what's going to happen next. How do people actually talk with one another? Can you give people an alternative? And so sometimes people do not necessarily take the complex ecosystem in which their people are interacting and really understand all of those levers before making what is quite a large change. So it's not that you shouldn't make change or that you should just do everything that's the same. It's understanding the complexity of factors behind it that really then changes your response, the support network that you provide to people. And I think the other point on training is incredibly important as well.
Right.
Because you're right. People are not being trained necessarily for their jobs, that especially in sort of the financial context. It's not about making widgets, for example, where you can measure that efficiency or the number of cars that you sort out over the course of a day or whatever it might be. The measures are much more nuanced. But when you talk about something like anti-bribery, corruption training, which is ubiquitous across, so much of what we see, what does a salesperson need to know versus someone in procurement need to know versus someone who runs admin meetings need to know? Different people need different lenses. There's different ways of looking at the sort of elephant example, different ways of looking at the same problem, but it's context specific to their role. And you're totally right. We start alienating people if we're not showing them that we understand their role, but also creating training experiences that are akin to what they might receive in their day-to-day lives, because the game has changed, right? The fact that you can beautifully utilize and the beautiful way of utilizing an iPhone, for example, or the elegance that comes with online platforms these days, that's something that we expect now in our office work, in our professional lives. And if that's not replicated, then already we've got a problem with how we're taking information in, or whether we take it in at all.
And it's become particularly stark, not just because we intuitively know it, but because as people are working remotely, it's much more obvious to me. And so I saw this, oh, my private life operates really slickly. I've got apps that just do what they need to do and they work really, and if they don't, I move to one that does, right? I find the easiest path.
Right.
And so I think when we look at this battle for attention, the more you need to get through to people, the more you need to be thinking about, I'm up against Netflix, I'm up against YouTube, I'm up against TikTok, I'm up against Peloton, whatever it is that grabs their attention in other contexts. That's the
Yeah.
benchmark that we need to aspire to, because actually that's what they expect and that's what they're used to seeing, and that is what grabs their attention. And so, how do we? It's perfect. Yeah, yes, somebody is theoretically doing, but they can have another window open with whatever it is they want to be doing in reality. So you're up
Yeah.
against that. And I think that's as you say, it's just the realities of where we're at. And I think we can pretend and say, oh, well, I refer to this as the employment contract fallacy, which is we employ people so we can tell them what to do. That is legally and theoretically correct. And we do have certain rights that govern for it. But if you genuinely want to get into someone's brain, if you want them to be attentive rather than just present, then we need to think in those terms.
There's a whole science of training, right, that people are not necessarily thinking about. There's the whole context, the ecosystem in which that training operates. So yes, even if you create something that is, it might be well designed, it might be a really fancy user experience, it might be animated, it might just be a bit different from what people are used to seeing. Does it matter if your sales targets are so high? Let's say take an anti-bribery context. Let's say if your sales targets are so high that people are being pushed to do things that they might not otherwise do, does it matter if you have the most amazing training, if there are elements of middle management who are turning a blind eye to sort of payoffs or, various other things along the way? What does that training actually do? And so again, I think about this from a much more of a complexity science approach, that you need to understand the wider picture. Training is one element of how the firm articulates its values. It's how we tell people what is right and wrong, but also the norms in the organization, what people say and do, and the evidence that people get on a day-to-day basis about what the organization thinks is right and wrong is so much more important and can be reinforced by the training, but also it can completely override a training context or sort of the preaching side of it, which I always liken to sort of the, sometimes I see some of these programs and it's a very Dalek style, you must comply, style of things, rather than, look, we're all in this together, understand our values, and this is, we don't do this here, or we do this here. We support our people. We, look after their well-being, whatever it might be that you're trying to get across. But it's quite a different mindset.
And it's fascinating. It's sort of, here's the theory of what happens in the training, and then the reality of actually what goes on the ground can be very different. And I think the greater the cognitive dissonance between the two, the more challenges you face. And I always look at things like induction training. Welcome to the megacorp. We're really big, and they give you a load of crap that you're not interested in, because I'm not thinking when I first join a company, is this an ethical outfit or not? And yet you go, we are a very ethical company. And you kind of think, why are they making big song dance about ethics? Surely that's a given. But I'll work out whether you're an ethical company by seeing what happens on the ground. And so if you've told me that you're an ethical company and I spot that we're not, right, because that's not, then I'm going to go with what I see on the ground all the time. And I'm going to then go, okay, any of this stuff coming out of the machine is just noise, right? I can just ignore that because I scope out the reality of what actually happens. And so it astonishes me again that this seems anathema to people. Whereas I think it's kind of obvious, and we know this from our day-to-day experiences. We know when we get bored of we know how we operate in the real world. And so there is this strange presumption that when suddenly we cross a physical threshold and walk into an office, or we log onto a computer system, that we're somehow fundamentally different people. We become far from being the interesting. And if you look at the job interview, right, we interview people and there's questions like, what hobbies do you have? What do you sort of, let's find out what sort of person you are. And so that's interesting and relevant when we hire people. So what sort of person are you? And then we kind of forget that when we bring them into the organization, we go, you're now an employee and we will treat you like an employee. And I just think that's, I'm not saying that everything we do in our private lives, we should automatically put, there are behavior standards and things, there are things I can do in my private lives that wouldn't in the office, but the fundamental me is the same thing.
Yeah.
And so it seems to me really interesting that that's treated as a different context.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. Thinking about whether or not people are even safe to be themselves in the workplace, it is also an interesting one, because not only are we saying to people, this is who we are as an organization, these are our values. Ideally we would have recruited someone for cultural add rather than cultural fit. We want different people coming in and a diverse range of viewpoints populating the organization, bringing things forward. But sometimes we end up then narrowing that scope, and people end up becoming just another wheel or another, element of the machine. And sometimes we lose their personalities and aspects. But also what we don't do enough of is allow those individuals to tell their stories in an organization. And so whenever we're thinking about, well, what do people's experiences actually look like at these organizations? What's their experience of the values? What's their lived experience in their day-to-day? We often tend to resort to purely quantitative measures, and we forget about that qualitative idea where we can get people to tell us exactly what's happening and form a picture of the organization, what they're doing that way, rather than the 80% of people are happy, 20% are not. Well, why does that happen? But why? Why do we care? What's important? What's the root cause behind this? And what does that tell us about our culture as an organization? And what does that tell us about the bits that we don't see, the informal elements, quite aside from the written rules and regulations and the ways of behaving and the public statements, all of those things? What's hidden behind those walls that we need to be cognizant of, because that's ultimately what's shaping behavior.
And that's interesting because it's really hard, right? So part of the reason that how do I know what's going on in the organization? Well, I will look for things that are easy to measure. And so I can look at, if I think about compliance, I can look at, well, the compliance rates. And as long as those rates are high, that's a good thing. And I can move on. And maybe I'll do the odd employee survey, say, how have you found the organization? And I won't think about, actually, are they doing this under duress? Right. So lots of employees say anonymous employee survey, and you're thinking, I don't trust that this is anonymous. So I'm going to respond in a sort of North Korean manner and give them the answer that they're looking for, because it's not, I'm scared of speaking up. And so I think there are lots of things that we take comfort from when it comes to sort of compliance and rules and regulations, and that don't really reflect the realities of how humans are. When you think about actually what are people going through, and therefore what are the drivers of their decision making and thinking, and what are the influences on them, and not, not sort of this beautifully stylized world where we're programming robots or algorithms. We've actually got human beings that are sentient, that recognize it. And so I think it's fascinating when we look at processes and say, well, they're just going to have to do this. Well, fine, maybe that is something that we have to get them to do, and it's a pain in the butt. But we should recognize it's a pain in the butt and say to ourselves, if something is a pain in the butt, then there is a greater likelihood of non-compliance. So if we can't change the process, maybe we can change the perception of the process. But if we can't even do that, then we just recognize that's a higher risk thing. Because a lot of people sort of say to me, well, we can't do anything about that. These are regulations. And I say, well, if you've got a behavioral lens on it, you'll recognize that not all regulations are the same. Some are going to be easy to comply with and people understand and get, and there's going to be other things that are much more complicated, much more challenging. And those therefore represent, from a behavioral perspective, a bigger challenge for us to overcome. So maybe we try and simplify those things. We focus on those things. We put more monitoring around it because there's a greater propensity to people not complying. And so it's really thinking about the employee experience, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. And we engage in risk every day. Risk is not a bad thing per se. It drives innovation. It challenges us to think in different ways. But what we need to be thinking about is whether or not we're living up to the expectations that are set for us by governments or regulations or whatever, or by society itself. Are we enabling people to do the right thing? Are we making it easy for people to do that? We're not, making sure we're not giving mixed messages. There's a story that my colleague tells, which I absolutely love, brings to bear lots of this way of thinking about things in a different way, reforming processes, making things easy. I once worked for a client regarding a personal dealing policy. The client's employees were allowed to trade what they wanted as long as it wasn't related to a client of the firm they worked for, or it wasn't related to business that the client was doing, so they didn't have non-public information regarding the relevant stocks or shares.
And so this, for listeners that aren't in banking, so this is a very common thing, right? So the basic idea here is that you don't want either actual conflict of interest or a perception of a conflict of interest. So banks are allowed to restrict what their employees can invest in a personal capacity. So what shares you can buy, for example, because in the nature of the employment that they have, they may come across information that is market sensitive. In other words, if you were to use it, would be insider dealing, or they don't even want to look like there is any risk of that. So even if the trading activity has nothing to do with it, if there is a perception, that's not good. And so these things are tightly controlled. So this is a good example where an employer is stretching into an employee's private life and sort of interfering what they can do for very good reason. But it's an interesting form of compliance that you outside that. And the reason I explain that context is outside that context, it might seem weird. What's that got to do with your employer? Well, the answer is it's directly related to your employment. So this is really sensitive from a human perspective. And therefore firms have to think about how they can make that work and get employees to understand it.
Absolutely, and so you really useful context. Sometimes you're in the middle of these things, you forget there's a wider group out there. You make the same behavioral mistakes that you hope not to tell other people not to make. Um, but this firm was, trying to think about a system where you put in the name of the client, what you're trading, and it either comes up with some flags. So automated system that tells you, I'm looking to trade this. I'm looking to trade this share for this company. Comes up with a red saying, "Don't do it," or comes up with a green saying, "Fine, we don't have any interest. Nothing on our books regarding this. Do what you want." All automated. However, my colleague recognized that in some circumstances, you put a company's name in that you wanted to trade, and it came up with a blue symbol. You said, what on earth does blue mean? And when you think about affordances, you think about culturally what's green means for a lot of Western cultures anyway. Green means go, and red means stop, danger, risk, whatever it might be. That blue was just an anathema. It didn't make any sense. And so instead of the firm helping the employee to comply or to make the correct decision, they were just confusing them. And that was leading to issues further down the line with, potential breaches of the policy. So just by experiencing and observing what individuals were doing, and by sort of just pulling out something really, really simple, there was a better chance that people would understand the risk and be compliant with the policies, but also understand where they stood in the overarching picture.
I think it's a really interesting example, and you're right. Is that what the hell? What does blue mean? And of course, what I find fascinating about it, the approach that most of us adopt to that is to sort of go, okay, right, here is a very, very tightly controlled environment. They tell me what I can and can't do, and none of us likes being told what to do or what not to do. We know that from childhood, but we've also know that when we come across irritating rules. So you sort of sit there and say, well, they haven't told me I can't, right? Because blue is not suggestive no.
Right.
And so I'm going to go ahead. And so I would argue that not only is that causing confusion, but it actually increases risk because it's not useful information. And I think what's interesting about the example that you've given around this personal account dealing is that there are certain things that the employer will be aware of, right? So the bank, to use an example, will have information that the employee doesn't have about what's happening in other parts of the organization. And so they have to help the employees to be able to say to them, look, actually, you may, you may not know anything about this, but it wouldn't look good, so we're not going to let you do it, right? And so you have to consult the central oracle to tell you whether there is the risk of perception of these things. But there's also an amount of responsibility the employee has, which is to say that actually, if I know something that is material to this particular thing, price sensitive information, in other words, if I were to use it, it would be insider dealing. If that exists, if I've got hold of that information, either through my job or through other means, then I shouldn't be trading this thing. And that goes way beyond what the company is able to tell you, because you may have gleaned it. If your brother's given you a tip off, that still poses a challenge for the employer, still subject to this same risk for the organization. And so if we create structures where we kind of give people the equivalent of stop, go, yes, you can, no, you can't, that basically, quite understandably, but also for people that are up to no good, gives you an opportunity to say, oh, well, they told me it was okay. It was fine. You need to think for yourself. And so when we design a lot of these processes, we kind of pretend that we've got it all covered. And we send a signal to people that as long as you follow our process, you're okay. And I think that's a bit like saying, as long as you stick within the speed limit, that's okay. Well, the speed limit is often a terrible guide as to what's safe. Sometimes the speed limit is way too in the middle of the night on the motorway. There is probably no risk in exceeding the speed limit. I'm not saying massively, but equally, there are times when the speed limit is way too high because it's just applied to an average situation. And so we don't encourage with some of these processes people to think for themselves. And we therefore also provide loopholes for people that are trying it on. And so I think, when you get to the design of those things, you're right. Blue is a night. What the hell does that mean? But we also have to shape it in a way that says to people, okay, this is part of the equation. There's another bit that you need to do for yourself.
Yes.
And we can't always do all the thinking for you. And that's why you're an adult. And we have to equip you with an understanding of what that means. And I think often we think, okay, the process here, make them do an approval process, job done. There's a ton more stuff to it, which if you don't think behaviorally, you'll never get to. But to your point is we've got to start from this there's a human being at the end of this that's going to need to react to whatever it is we're doing and to think for themselves.
Absolutely. And you're teasing out there the difference between maybe a culture of compliance versus a culture of ethics, and equipping people to make the right decision in what are often incredibly difficult situations, right? I mean, I'm going to take the view that yes, there are some bad actors, but most people want to do the best for themselves, their team, whatever the firm, whatever it might be. And at that point, you want to be giving them an understanding of what the firm sees as right and wrong. They have experienced that from their managers, from the board, whomever else they are, see in a position of authority. And that is really ultimately what guides their decision, their values. How do I want to show up in this situation? Well, I have seen this time and time again at my firm that we do not accept this behavior. We always say X or Y, whatever it might be. And that's what then informs what action they take. Now, of course, we've got to make it easy, of course, for them to follow the rules. If they're not quite sure what's going on, one click, I can have a look at what the process is rather than it being buried on the internet somewhere, or I can speak to someone about something. But it's not about learning every single situation because we just can't. There's only a certain amount of things. On top of, doing your day job and being a technical expert, all of the other things that we have to do, you cannot learn a 60, 100-page manual. But what you can do is have your street smarts on. We can train people to red flag those situations that things a bit iffy. I'm going to go to someone who understands. Who's that person that understands? Well, I know that this person is the right person, or this channel, this hotline, whatever it might be. That's enough. You sort of help them take that action. And they might have to make a split-second decision, and that's where the values, the integrity, the nature of the organization comes in. That's very different from a rules-based approach. You can't write a rule for everything. Life is just too complex. And so there's much more nuance to the way in which we have to deal with our human beings who work for us.
I always think about the distinction between the sort of the physical world. So things that are governed by the laws of physics or chemistry or whatever. So if I look at engineering as a good example, there are some laws there that will always apply. And we know that gravity would be a really good example of something that consistently applies. And so we can look at that, and you can therefore codify certain things in the physical world where you go, this will always happen. And therefore we want to prevent, mix these two elements together and you get an explosion, right? So we always need to keep those things apart. And we know that under whatever circumstances, if we mix these two elements, that's a risk. So we need to so we can codify how people behave around that. And so physical risk can be codified. But when we think about things like ethics, what's appropriate in situation A may not be appropriate in situation B. And so if we were to codify it for thinking about situation A, actually situation B would come along and somebody would go, oh, but the rule says this, I will slavishly follow the rule, and you get the wrong outcome. And so I think it's really interesting to sort of to recognize the distinction between things where, we can absolutely codify it and things where we can't. And trouble is most things don't lend themselves to being codified in that way. But actually, even if I think about the physical world, if I look about a car, to drive a car doesn't require me to understand the engineering behind it. I don't need to know what goes on in the engine and the electronics. I just need to know what do the buttons do and how can I make this thing move slow down. That's different to an engineer who needs to fix the thing.
Yes.
And so even in that physical world, we draw delineations between what people need to know. And I think this idea of what is it you need to know? What level of knowledge do you need to be able to do whatever it is organizationally we need you to do? And so this temptation of, oh, let's do compliance training that almost turns everybody into mini compliance officers, right? They're not, as I always say, they're not interested in compliance, because if they were, they'd be working in compliance. They're interested in sales or whatever it is their day job is. And they just need to know what is the level of information required for them to be able to do their job in a manner that we want. And so that's not about downloading everything that you know onto them. It's about giving them the right level of understanding that makes sense to them.
Absolutely. And, that might come across a number of different contexts. They might take your car analogy a little bit further. They might be driving a car, usually, that's one that they own. But sometimes they need to go on holiday and they get a hire car. And they need to be given a little bit of information to help them know how to put the lights on, where a brake is, whatever it might be. And so if you think about that from the compliance context, you need to remember that people will be doing their day jobs, but they might also find themselves in certain situations. And we give them a little bit of guidance, a bit of guardrails, and the person whom they can speak to if they need some further assistance when they're in a different situation to their day job, so that they're not caught unawares.
Right, and I love that, and of course, recognizing they might not realize that.
Yes.
So where that, the car rental thing, the analogy stops is at least we know when we're renting a car, right? This isn't
Yep.
my usual vehicle. I'm a bit confused. And I think maybe the analogy is you go to a country where they drive on the other side of the road. You
Yes.
could easily forget that that's the case, and so, that's why we have those signs in tourist locations in the UK, for example, that explain to people they need to drive on the left, because it's very easy to forget that. And so I think, when we look at these situations, it's again, it's not a straightforward thing of I obviously know that I'm in a strange situation. Sometimes I might not recognize it, I
Mm.
might forget. And hey, guess what? People are tired and distracted and have other things on their plate. And it's not. I always think it's interesting. Is sort of what is their top priority? Well, their top priority is to keep their job and to do well at their job. And so we need to be thinking about, well, how is what we're asking them to do or think about, how is that impeding or supporting that objective? And if it's supporting that objective, then there's a greater likelihood they'll do it. If it's impeding it, if we're asking them to do something that feels unnatural and awkward, let's recognize that and say we're asking them to do something out of the ordinary. And therefore, that requires us to think a bit more carefully about that than a situation where we're not.
Yeah. I think that's right. And it's that appreciation, isn't it? We talked about this before, just stepping back and understanding the context in which people are operating, why they're doing something, why they might not be doing something. And that really makes a difference. Um, and ultimately also makes the person feel loved because they're getting, I say this not as a joke, but people get the fact that you're looking after them, that you're understanding their way of working, what you do. It's not a generalized view. More generally, we're talking about personalization of software and this, that, and the other. Well, this is relevant content at the relevant time for the relevant person. And that, I think, makes a real difference in achieving your sort of overall objectives about making sure that the company's going in the right direction.
And I love that personalization thing, because if we think about other contexts, we know that that's super effective. I always talk about Starbucks, for example, the idea they write your name on the cup. Now, of course, that's designed for social media, right? Which is like, right, and I know a lot of places now print labels, but when they handwrite it, they may spell your name wrong, and sometimes I think that's deliberately done because it's like, why would you share details of your morning cup of coffee on social media? Well, you're going to do it if they've screwed up your name, or if it's funny. And so there's a social media trick there. But it's also designed, this is your coffee. We've made it for you. It's personalized, it's customized. And so on some visceral level, we know that, and yes, of course, we know in reality that there's a sort of production line, but actually there is a sense of this is made for me. And so there is something that plays on this. And so we know in that context, we know that when letters are written, dear, dear leaseholder, if you're in a block of flats, is
Right.
different to dear Christian, right?
Yeah.
It's a really silly little thing. So we know that from these other contexts. And so to your point is, we should be thinking about that in that, because the human emotion attached to the engagement is the same that we'd have in the outside world.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. And I mean, going back to your Starbucks example, I sort of disagree a little bit. Is if you're gonna do personalization, then get it right. You know,
Yeah.
get for me, it always gets my back up because we talked about this before. Name pronunciation is so important. Or understanding who you are and the fact that it's an important part of you. It's great when you've got a barista who knows you and you have that conversation. But can I just call you John? We're going to have problems. And so if you're going to do it right and be conscientious about what you're doing. Um,
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think so what's interesting for me is I still believe that Starbucks have factored in that screw up factor and are prepared to run that risk. But I agree with you entirely. The basic principle should be, let's get this thing right. And I think in a compliance context, that's particularly important because at least I'm going into a coffee shop voluntarily buying a coffee. So there's an element of I want to be here and I want the end product. Whereas if I'm being sent like compliance email or required to go on training, right? That is not something where I'm going to go, yay! I can't wait. Got my coffee. I've gone in to get coffee because I'm a bit tired, right? And I want my coffee. Then, as opposed to, oh god, I've got an email here. And so I think the sort of the mindset that you're approaching the exercise in, if something is being forced on you,
Yes.
it's incumbent on the people forcing it on you, if they want your engage if they don't care. I talk a lot about visa processes. Countries don't need to make visa processes that friendly if there is enough demand for people to go there. So I always used to find the process to get into the US, where they used to ask me about, were you involved in Nazi Germany? And are you coming here with the are you coming here with the objective of committing crime? And they used to ask about things like moral turpitude. I've no idea what moral turpitude is, but I kind of know what the right answer. Now, they can get away with that because I want to go to the US. And so they can afford to piss me off, right? It's irrelevant. I have no choice in that matter. But if you look at a compliance context, yeah, sure, employees needs to do these things, otherwise ultimately they will get fired. But if you want them to do it to a particular standard, or to take the exercise seriously, or to pay attention, then we need to be thinking in those terms. You're right. And that's when the misspelling your name or saying, dear employee, right, is not get people to go, oh, this is going to be really relevant to me. It's going to go to the bottom of the to-do list, but it's also going to go to the bottom of the attention pile when it does get to the top of the to-do list.
Yeah. And I think there are ways of doing it. And, it may well be that there isn't just a mass email, and that it's actually something that's cascaded through various teams. And, I've been talking to people about utilizing ethics ambassadors, for example, and having people who know what you do as your day job, who are able to then, not compliance officers necessarily, but people who are able to sort of bridge that gap, and translate some of the more complicated technical aspect with some compliance team, for example. They might be good fonts for training. There are other ways of doing it where all you need to do is to understand your own context. And in some contexts, actually, it might be a small enough organization that an email from the CEO saying, this is important to me, I am coming along, we are making this happen because this is how we do business, does the job. In a massive conglomerate, it might be a completely different approach.
Right. And but I'm reminded of those things where that goes wrong, and you get the sort of I've seen it happen where we've got a training thing or a presentation or something, right? And the senior person turns up and says, "This is really important," and then they go, "Today we're going to teach you about checks notes,
Right.
ethics, something training, and this is very important. And I've been told to say this is really important." And then they either bugger off straight away, or if they do stick around, they're sitting in the back playing on their phone, right, paying no attention at all. And I always think it's really funny because that makes it worse, right? You'd be better off not
Yeah.
seeing a person showing up at all than this half-hearted thing. And I saw there was one example I was present at where the senior person did the sort of read the script badly, but they read the script. At least they were on message, and then just went, right, so you'll be doing that. I've got to go and do something really important. And I just thought that was they clearly understood the dynamic of having the senior person in the room was powerful. But as ever with these behavioral things, right, is that it can tip the other way. So you can screw it up badly and make things worse, because back to this point, we're sentient and we're reacting to what's put in front of us, and we have opinions and views on things that shape not just that moment, but how we perceive control frameworks, rules, training processes, behaviors in a much broader context.
And I think if you are going to, if you're going to do it right. If you're going to go halfway, it's not worth doing. And ultimately, when you're running a training session or any sort of outreach, you have to remember you're on show. It is like you are on stage, and all of the elements that are on that stage, whether it's the props, the people, the sound, the lighting, all of that stuff is making an impact on the individual person. Not everyone will pick up on all of those cues, but you better believe that if one or two of those cues is off, you are going to be in a worse position than you might otherwise have been had this just been a standard thing that someone read. And so, you have to be incredibly careful, context sensitive in how you do it. And you get results. It can be done. It's just being intentional and deliberate about this rather than not necessarily appreciating the entirety of the situation. or appreciating how much you can have an impact on someone.
Right. And I think it's all the lots of little things matter. And so just thinking about the big picture things, it's sort of the tone of how we do things, how we present it, when we send messages to people, the language that we use. I always think there's a strange thing with regulations where it's kind of like, we'll badge the training by the name of the regulation. And I think that's interesting because that's speaking your language to the people. They don't care. They're not interested in the deal. So unless the regulation is something that's been hitting the headlines, I could argue something like
Mhm.
GDPR, they may have read about it. And there may be a question to say, well, okay, I've seen this in, I don't know, the FT or whatever. How, like, I want to know how that's relevant to me. And therefore naming it might make sense. But if we lead with, I don't know, the Volcker rule, to pick a US example, right? That's just like, you can guarantee that if they read that word in the press, their eyes are going to gloss over. What the hell does this? And so if we're badging something with that, it's almost like sort of, you wouldn't badge a TV show with a title that was really boring television, unless you were being ironic, right? Here's
Right.
something really dull for you to look at. And I think branding trade, it's much better to sort of find ways that are almost clickbaity, right? Gauge people's interest. And so we often start from the theoretical. Like, I'm going to teach you about this regulation. Well, that's speaking your theoretical language. What they care about is, how can I do my job in the right way? Because the average employee is not, as you said, is
Mhm.
not turning up to break the rules. And rule breakers don't pay attention to training anyway. So if my objective is to break the rules, the only attention I'm paying is, can I identify loopholes and work out how I can get around this? That's the only thing they care about. They're not listening to the rest of it. So we need to design things for willing participants, design for the willing, not the willful. And so I think sometimes badging training with a particular regulation, but you can still tick the regulatory box and teach people about a particular without even naming the damn thing. Right? I don't need to know that it's called that unless there's going to be a situation where that vocabulary becomes relevant to me. At which point, don't assume that I know why it's relevant from the start point. You've got to grab my attention, and then maybe at the end of it, you can say to me, "Well, this is called this," just in case you come across this is called, or you get quizzed by a regulator who's coming for inspection. We've covered that in this thing, but let's not lead with that because that's not the newspaper headline that's going to buy the paper.
Yeah. And it it's sometimes that people have no time. This is what the rule says. It's a knowledge-based exercise. Sometimes it's a rote learning style exercise because that's how they've been taught. And it's very, very different to engage with the material to pull out, why is it relevant for my audience who are sales people, or why is it relevant for my audience who actually are fellow compliance officers? You know, two very, very different frames and two different audiences who need to know different things about those rules. One might be a lot simpler, one might be a lot more detailed. So what do they need to know about to do their jobs better? And can I engage with the material to really tease out what is important?
Right.
And I think that, and that then goes to, how do you measure this? Can you actually measure the impact that this training is having on people? Well, you do that by making sure that it is on point, because does a knowledge test really reflect what someone's actually going to do in an anti-bribery context or a corruption context? Maybe, but maybe it doesn't. And what is it that you actually want someone to learn? And if you hook that, your training is much better, but then you've actually got measurable outcomes at the end of it, more than just an attendance sheet. You've actually got something that you can say, we need people to get to this level, or they were at this level and now they're here, and this is what's relevant for their job.
Right. One of the things I've been musing on is, if we take the field of info security or cybersecurity, there's a technique that is used there that I think is interesting. And that is to say that, okay, we want to stop people clicking on phishing emails. So we can train not to do that and we can tell them not to do it. But what they actually do is they send people fake phishing emails and see what happens. And on the one hand, that is genius because it's actually saying, okay, well, if we want to understand the risks that we're facing in regard to this thing, the only way we'll really know is to put people in a position where they could screw up. And we'll create a simulation of what do they do when this happens. And so that gives us a handle on the risk that we're running. It's also a learning opportunity for people because it's a safe way to test out. But it all depends, to my mind, is how you then handle it. If you then go, right, all you people that clicked on this thing are going to have to go through extra training because you're a bunch of idiots, it's almost entrapment. And I can see why, from an ethical perspective, that starts to pose problems. But it's a very logical way to try and approach it. And it's thinking about the fact that you can theoretically tell people to do things. We won't know what they do until they actually come across it. It's the Mike Tyson quote about everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. So I like that thinking, but I also recognize there are going to be some things where you can't look. Let's not put someone in a position where they could inside a deal and steal that's right, because that
Right.
starts to feel unethical. And I don't know where the limits are. But what I think is really interesting is that it seems to be accepted in the cyberspace. They get away with it, at least most organizations they do, because they don't push it too far. And the ones that I think get away with it most is the ones where there's thinking about, we're not trying to irritate employees, annoy them, make them feel trapped. We're trying to teach them something useful, and we're not wasting their time with some exercise with a huge sort of massive amount of entrapment going on. But I think that thinking could be deployed in other situations to say, look, the only way you're going to really know if your training is effective is to see what happens on the ground. And there are going to be situations where you absolutely can't create those dynamics. Let's see what happens. But there are others where I think you might be able to. But I like the thinking with a heavy dose of let's consider the ethics of what we're doing here, and whether that is appropriate, and whether just because we can do it doesn't mean we should. But I think that sort of thinking, to my mind, is the right way forward, as opposed to your point around how do we know we trained 1,000 people? Well, actually, you got 1,000 people to log on to something or put their bum on a seat. That's an input, right? That doesn't tell you anything about how they paid attention. And I love this idea of the training of the test as well. It's like this kind of like, okay, I'm going to tell you some things, and then I'm going to ask you seconds later whether you can regurgitate. I mean, that's just it's like it's idiotic, and yet that happens, and a job done. Right. And if your instant recall is not good enough, then you're not paying attention. I mean, what's that going to do to people when you fail them on a test like that? They're not going to take your exercise any more seriously.
No, and again, it's about looking at this holistically. What does it mean for people in 6 months' time? What does it mean for people in a year's time? Is that recall even necessary for what they're doing? Or do you want to teach them the patterns of behavior that they should undergo when they come across a red flag situation, and how to understand when a situation is a bit off and it smells bad, it needs a bit of, needs a bit of attention, or to bounce an idea off someone? How do you allow people to make mistakes in a safe space? And this is what you're talking about on a sort of grander scale, but how do where's that safety to have those conversations, to think about those gray areas?
Nitish, as ever with great guests, time is against us, and you and I, we know this, right? We could talking forever. But before I let you go, I just want to get a sense from you of what you're doing. So we've heard a little bit about your philosophy and the ideas and the way you're approaching things, which chimes hugely with me. But what does your day job involve? What kinds of projects are you working on?
And so I get to be at the intersection between the legal world, innovation, behavioral science, and a whole host of other skills that my colleague at R&G Insights Lab bring to the table. Everything from cultural psychology to data journalism, experience at some of the world's biggest enforcement agencies. And we get to apply those to the world of organizational challenges. I mean, behavioral science isn't the magic bullet, but combining those disciplines may well get us much further than we think. So in the design world, if you want a better answer, you ask a better question. And so some of the questions that we're focusing on a day-to-day basis to resolve: how do you measure culture? We already know it's a complex web of interacting elements, but we've got quite a unique way of mapping it. And then, if it's necessary, how do you bring about cultural change? How do you bring insights from human behavior into how you train your people? We talked a lot about that today. Is my DEI program having an impact? There's a huge discussion in the market about just that. How do I conduct a compliance risk assessment that gives me actionable insights, things that I can actually translate into what I do next? How do I test which of the many options of remediation after something has gone wrong will actually work best for my organization? So we're sort of covering everything from measuring risk, to shaping behavior and culture. And it's all done with a human-centered and data-driven mindset. So we essentially get to use our vast range of experiences and skill sets, perspectives, helping clients on a journey towards a new way of thinking. It's sort of where legal meets human.
And I come back to the start point fact that this is happening within a law firm. Because if you ask me to point within organizations to a function that's not always helpful to thinking in these terms, I would be pinpointing it and saying, the internal legal functions, external lawyers, quite rightly and understandably, are focused on how do we protect the legal position and how do we manage that, what I call the courtroom risk or litigation risk or regulatory sanction risk. And that backside covering in that space doesn't necessarily always lend itself to think in those terms. And I love the fact that it's coming out of that discipline because I think that's very exciting because you've got one eye on, well, what are the legal priorities and what are, how do lawyers think about this? And so it's bridging that gap. And so for me, I think this is a great place to start because otherwise you set up this battle between the behavioral stuff and the legal stuff. And I think we have to think about both. And so I love the fact that you've got a law firm that's thinking in those terms.
R&G Insights Lab is a unique place to be. And, that's exciting. I hope it inspires lots of other people to think about the legal world and the compliance world in behavioral terms, and not just behavioral terms, in cultural terms, in terms that maybe we haven't even thought of yet. But it's all of those different lenses that I think will lend itself to changing the way that we do business and hopefully helping us get to a place where we do the right thing. And it's easy to do the right thing.
Well, as I said, we could keep talking forever, and no doubt we will have lots more conversations, and I'm sure I will tempt you back onto the show in a future date. But Nitish, for now, thank you, one, for the conversation, two, for what you're doing, because I think it's really interesting and innovative. To close us out, tell people how they can find you if they want to discover more.
Come and find me on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear from you. And if you want a better sense of what R&G Insights Lab is really about, listen to our podcast. It's called The Better Way, and it's a lighthearted take on a series of organizational challenges that all of us face and different ways of approaching them, finding a better way.
And as ever, listeners that didn't have a pen or keyboard to hand can find links to those things in the show notes. But for now, Nitish, thank you so much for, one, the work you do, but secondly, for being a great guest on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My huge thanks to Nitish for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Nitish and his work at Ropes and Grey Insights Lab, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. You'll also find a link to the Ropes and Grey podcast that Nitish referred to, which is well worth a listen. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. Don't forget that my book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioral Science to Ethics and Compliance, is out now. Links to that are in the show notes, and you can also read the first few chapters for free by following the link that's there. As ever, thank you so much for those of you that got in touch with feedback and thoughts on the show. I love hearing from you, so do get in touch if you've got anything you want to share. In the meantime, stay safe. Remember that law is all about influencing human behavior. And thank you so much for listening.